July 31, 2015. A Friday night in Mexico City. The kind of night when the city comes alive. People heading out for dinner. Drinks with friends. The weekend stretching ahead with possibility. In the Narvarte neighborhood, a middle-class area in the south of the city, life was going on as usual. Narvarte is the kind of place where you know your neighbors. Where corner stores stay open late. Where street vendors sell tacos to people stumbling home from bars. In an apartment on Luz Savinon Street, 5 people were going about their evening. They had no idea it would be their last. Ruben Espinoza was a photojournalist. 31 years old. He'd moved to Mexico City from Veracruz State just 2 months earlier. He was running from something: threats, intimidation, the kind of danger that comes when you photograph things powerful people don't want photographed. Nadia Vera was an activist. 32 years old. Also from Veracruz. She'd fled the same threats as Ruben. They'd been documenting human rights abuses, corruption, violence. The kind of work that makes you enemies. Yesenia Quiroz was a makeup artist. 18 years old. Young. Full of life. She was at the apartment doing Nadia's makeup. Wrong place, wrong time. Alejandra Negrete was a social worker. 40 years old. She'd gone to the apartment to visit a friend. Another case of being somewhere you shouldn't have been. And Mile Virginia Martin was a housekeeper. 32 years old. A Colombian woman working in Mexico to support her family back home. She cleaned the apartment. She was just doing her job. 5 people. 5 lives. 5 stories cut short in the most brutal way imaginable. Because sometime on that Friday night, someone entered that apartment. Multiple someones. Armed. Dangerous. With a purpose. What happened next was a massacre. 5 people tortured. Raped. Murdered. Left in that apartment for the neighbors to find the next day. But here's what makes this case different. What makes it matter beyond just another horrific crime in a city, a country, plagued by violence. 4 of the 5 victims were women. 4 of the 5 were killed in an apartment in one of the safe neighborhoods of Mexico City. And one of the victims was a journalist who'd been documenting government corruption. The official story? A robbery gone wrong. Random violence. Bad luck. But everyone who knew the victims, everyone who understood what they'd been working on, knew better. This wasn't random. This was a message. A warning. And the way the Mexican authorities handled the investigation, the cover-ups, the lies, the character assassination of the victims, that told a story too. This is about more than just 5 murders. It's about what happens when journalists and activists threaten the powerful. It's about violence against women in Mexico. It's about corruption so deep that justice becomes impossible. This is the story of the Narvarte apartment murders. And what it reveals about Mexico in 2015. A Mexico where telling the truth can get you killed. Where being a woman makes you a target. Where the police are sometimes more dangerous than the criminals. Let me tell you what really happened. Saturday, August 1, 2015. Late morning. The neighbors started noticing something was wrong. The smell. That's what got their attention first. In the heat of Mexico City summer, in an apartment that had been closed up for hours, the smell of death travels. Someone called the building manager. The manager knocked on the door of the apartment. No answer. More knocking. Still nothing. The manager had a key. Opened the door. And found a scene that would haunt everyone who saw it. 5 bodies. Blood everywhere. Signs of violence so extreme that even hardened investigators would later say it was one of the worst crime scenes they'd encountered. The police were called. They arrived quickly. secured the scene, started their investigation. And almost immediately, things started going wrong. The crime scene was contaminated. Too many people walking through. Evidence potentially compromised. The kind of mistakes that make prosecution difficult if not impossible. But worse than the technical errors was what came next. The narrative the authorities started building before they'd even identified all the victims. It was a robbery. Drug-related, probably. The victims must have been involved in something. No one gets killed like this unless they're mixed up in bad things. Within hours. Before any real investigation had been conducted, before forensics had been analyzed, before witnesses had been properly interviewed, the Mexico City Attorney General's office was already telling reporters what had happened. It appears to be a robbery, they said. We're investigating possible links to organized crime. Never mind that nothing of significant value had been taken from the apartment. Never mind that this didn't fit the pattern of any robbery anyone had ever seen. The official narrative was set. And it would take activists, journalists, and the victims' families weeks of fighting to get anyone to consider that maybe, just maybe, there was more to this story. Because once the victims were identified, once people realized who was dead in that apartment, everything changed. Ruben Espinoza. A photojournalist who'd been receiving death threats for months. Who'd fled Veracruz because he feared for his life. Who'd told friends just weeks before his death that if anything happened to him, it wouldn't be an accident. Nadia Vera. An activist who'd publicly accused the Veracruz governor of creating a climate of fear and violence. Who'd said, on camera, that if she was killed, the governor would be responsible. These weren't random victims. These were people who'd made enemies. Powerful enemies. And now they were dead. Murdered in a random robbery that the authorities seemed very eager to close quickly and quietly. The families weren't buying it. The journalist community wasn't buying it. Human rights activists weren't buying it. Because they knew something the general public was just starting to understand. In Mexico, journalists don't die in random robberies. They die because someone wants them dead. And the 3 other women who died alongside Ruben and Nadia? They were collateral damage. Wrong place, wrong time. Killed because they witnessed something. Or killed to make it look like something it wasn't. The crime scene told a story. A story of prolonged violence. Of torture. Of sexual assault. Of execution. But the authorities wanted to tell a different story. A simpler story. A story that didn't raise uncomfortable questions about press freedom. About violence against women. About government complicity. The battle over which story would be believed. Which story would become the official record, was just beginning. To understand why this case matters, you need to understand who Ruben Espinoza was. And what he'd been documenting before he died. Ruben was born in Veracruz in 1984. He grew up wanting to be a photographer. Not the kind who shoots weddings and quinceañeras. The kind who documents reality. Who shows people what's really happening. He got into photojournalism in the mid-2000s. Started covering protests, political events, social movements. He was good at it. Had an eye for the shot that told the whole story. The image that made you feel something. But in Veracruz, photojournalism is dangerous work. Because Veracruz is one of the most dangerous states in Mexico. For everyone, but especially for journalists. The state is controlled by drug cartels and corrupt politicians who are often working together. It's a place where reporting the truth can get you killed. Where journalists disappear. Where bodies turn up with signs of torture. Between 2010 and 2015, at least 14 journalists were killed in Veracruz. 14. In 5 years. In one state. And the governor during most of that time was Javier Duarte. A man who would later flee Mexico, be arrested in Guatemala, and be extradited back to face corruption charges. A man who presided over one of the bloodiest, most corrupt administrations in recent Mexican history. Rubin photographed protests against Duarte. Documented disappearances. Covered stories about corruption and violence that other media outlets were too scared to touch. And he started receiving threats. Messages telling him to stop. To leave Veracruz. To quit journalism or face consequences. His apartment was broken into. His equipment stolen. He was followed. Photographed. Intimidated. In March 2015, Rubin's friend and colleague, the journalist Moises Sanchez, was kidnapped and murdered in Veracruz. His body was found dismembered. That was when Rubin decided he had to leave. He moved to Mexico City in June 2015. Just 2 months before he was killed. He thought Mexico City would be safer. The capital. More eyes watching. More protection for journalists. He was wrong. Even in Mexico City, Rubin kept documenting. Kept photographing protests. Kept doing the work that had made him a target. And he kept talking about what was happening in Veracruz. Kept calling out Javier Duarte. Kept refusing to be silent. In an interview just weeks before his death, Rubin said, "I left Veracruz because I didn't feel safe. There's a climate of violence against journalists there that the government won't acknowledge. They want us to self-censor. To stop reporting. I won't do that." His last Instagram post was a photo from a protest. The caption. "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing." 3 days later, he was dead. The photojournalism community in Mexico was devastated. But not surprised. Because this is what happens. This is the pattern. Journalist reports on corruption. Journalist receives threats. Journalist is killed. Authorities call it a robbery or blame organized crime. Case goes unsolved. Other journalists get the message, stay quiet or you're next. Rubin's death fit the pattern perfectly. Too perfectly. And that's why, from day one, people who knew him refused to accept the official story. Because they'd seen this script before. And they knew how it ended. Nadia Vera wasn't a journalist. But she was just as dangerous to the powerful. Maybe more so. She was an activist. A feminist. An anthropologist. Someone who spoke truth to power without hesitation or fear. Nadia was born in Xalapa, Veracruz in 1983. She studied social anthropology. Got involved in student movements. Women's rights. Human rights. Social justice. She was brilliant. Articulate. Fearless. The kind of person who could explain complex social issues in ways that made people care. That made them angry. That made them want to act. And in Veracruz under Javier Duarte, that made her a threat. Nadia documented disappearances. She worked with families of missing persons. She organized protests demanding justice. She called out the governor publicly and repeatedly. In 2014, she gave an interview to a documentary filmmaker. In that interview, she said something chilling. "If something happens to me, if I disappear, if they kill me, I'm holding Javier Duarte responsible. The governor of Veracruz. Him and his government. They've created a climate of terror and violence. They persecute anyone who speaks out. If I die, it's because of them." That interview was filmed a year before she was murdered. Nadia also fled to Mexico City. Like Rubin, she thought the capital would be safer. Like Rubin, she was wrong. But she didn't stop her activism. She kept organizing. Kept protesting. Kept demanding accountability. She was living in the Narvard apartment. Had been there for a while. Ruben moved in with her when he arrived in Mexico City. They were friends. Colleagues. Both fleeing the same threats from the same state. On the day she was killed, Nadia had plans. She was getting her makeup done by Yesenia. They were going out. Just a normal Friday night. Instead, she became another statistic. Another woman killed in Mexico. Another activist silenced. But here's what makes Nadia's case even more tragic. She'd predicted it. She'd said, on camera, that if she died, it would be because of her activism. Because of what she knew. Because of what she'd documented. And then exactly that happened. After her death, that interview went viral. Millions of people watched Nadia, alive and vibrant, saying that Javier Duarte would be responsible if anything happened to her. And then seeing that she was dead. It was damning. It should have triggered an immediate, thorough investigation into whether Duarte or his government had any connection to her murder. Instead, the Veracruz government attacked her. Called her a liar. Said she was mentally unstable. Tried to discredit her even in death. The Mexico City authorities, meanwhile, stuck to their robbery story. Even though Nadia's prediction, her explicit statement about who would be responsible if she died, should have been impossible to ignore. Nadia's family and friends were devastated. But also furious. Because Nadia had warned them. She'd known she was in danger. She'd said so publicly. And still, nothing had been done to protect her. And now that she was dead, nothing was being done to find out who killed her. Her murder wasn't just a crime. It was a silencing. A message to other activists: this is what happens when you speak out. But Nadia had anticipated even that. Because before she died, she'd said, they can kill me, but they can't kill my ideas. They can't silence the truth. Others will keep fighting. And she was right. Her death galvanized activists across Mexico. Made her a symbol of resistance. A martyr for the cause of justice and human rights. But her family would have preferred she stayed alive. Would have preferred that someone had listened to her warnings. Had taken her threats seriously. Instead, she became another name on a list that was already far too long. Yesenia Quiroz, Alejandra Negrete, and Mile Virginia Martin aren't talked about as much as Ruben and Nadia. But they matter just as much. Because their deaths reveal something else about this case. Something about violence against women in Mexico. About how women are seen. How women are valued. Yesenia was 18. Just 18. She was a makeup artist. Talented. Building a client base. Building a future. She was at the apartment doing Nadia's makeup. They had plans to go out. A normal Friday night for two women in their 20s and 30s. Yesenia had her whole life ahead of her. She died because she was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Or did she? Because there's another possibility. One that investigators should have considered but didn't seem to. What if Yesenia was targeted too? What if her death wasn't just collateral damage? All four women in that apartment were sexually assaulted before they were killed. All four showed signs of torture. This wasn't just about silencing journalists and activists. This was about violence against women. About sending a message about what happens to women who step out of line. Or who witness things they shouldn't. Alejandra Negrete was 40. A social worker. Mother of a young daughter. She'd gone to the apartment to visit a friend. She was described by everyone who knew her as kind. Caring. Dedicated to helping others. She died violently. Brutally. For no reason that makes any sense if this was really just a robbery. Her daughter lost her mother. Her family lost a beloved member. The social service community lost a dedicated professional. And the investigation barely mentioned her. She became a footnote. One of the victims. As if her life, her death, didn't matter as much as the famous journalist and activist. Mile Virginia Martin was from Colombia. She'd come to Mexico to work. To send money home to her family. She was a domestic worker. She cleaned apartments. She was at the Narvarte apartment doing her job. Cleaning. She probably let the killers in, thinking they were visitors. She was the first one killed. Shot in the head. Quickly. Maybe because she wasn't the target. Or maybe to silence her before she could call for help. Mile's story is particularly tragic because she represents millions of women in Latin America. Migrant workers. Domestic workers. Women doing essential but undervalued labor. Women who are often invisible to society until something terrible happens to them. Her family in Colombia was devastated. They'd sent their daughter to Mexico for safety. For opportunity. For a better life. Instead, she was murdered. And her death was barely investigated. The Mexican authorities seemed to view her as the least important victim. She wasn't famous. She wasn't Mexican. She was just a housekeeper. But she was a person. She had a family. She had dreams. She mattered. All three of these women matter. Their deaths are just as important as Ruben's and Nadia's. But the way the case was investigated, the way the media covered it, the way the authorities talked about it. It was all focused on the journalist and the activist. The other three women were afterthoughts. Collateral damage in someone else's story. And that tells you something about Mexico. About how women are valued. About whose deaths matter and whose don't. It's a pattern you see again and again. When women are killed in Mexico, and women are killed at horrifying rates, the investigation often depends on who they are. On whether they're respectable. On whether their deaths fit a narrative that authorities want to tell. Yesenia, Alejandra, and Mile deserved better. They deserved a thorough investigation. They deserved justice. They deserved to be remembered as people, not just as collateral damage in someone else's murder. From the moment the bodies were discovered, the investigation was a disaster. Whether that was incompetence or intentional, we may never know. Probably both. Let's start with the crime scene. The first rule of any murder investigation is to secure the scene. Preserve evidence. Photograph everything before anyone touches anything. Control who enters and exits. None of that happened properly at the Narvarte apartment. Too many police officers entered before the scene was properly documented. Too many people walking through, potentially contaminating evidence. Footprints in blood that could have belonged to the killers or could have been from first responders. No way to know because nobody controlled access properly. Forensic evidence was collected haphazardly. Some things photographed, others not. Chain of custody questionable on key pieces of evidence. The kind of mistakes that defense attorneys love. The kind that can get evidence thrown out of court. The kind that makes solving cases almost impossible. But the physical errors were just the beginning. The real problems came with how the authorities handled the investigation publicly. Within hours. The Mexico City Attorney General's office was telling media that this appeared to be a robbery. That they were looking into possible links to organized crime. They hadn't even finished identifying all the victims yet. They certainly hadn't analyzed the forensic evidence. They hadn't interviewed neighbors thoroughly. They hadn't established a timeline. But they knew it was a robbery. How? What evidence pointed to that conclusion so quickly? The answer is, none. It was a conclusion reached because it was convenient. Because it fit a narrative that didn't raise uncomfortable questions or failed to progress, more problems emerged. The authorities initially claimed that the women had been sexually assaulted, but Rubin had not been. They used this to support their robbery theory. The attackers were there to rob, saw the women, assaulted them, things got out of control. But forensic evidence later suggested Rubin had also been sexually assaulted. That detail was buried. Didn't fit the narrative. The authorities claimed nothing of value was missing from the apartment. Then later said expensive camera equipment was taken. Then later admitted they couldn't actually confirm what was or wasn't stolen because they didn't have a complete inventory. The timeline kept changing. When the victims were killed. When the bodies were discovered. When police were notified. Different officials gave different times. Witness statements were taken but not properly followed up on. Neighbors who reported seeing suspicious people or vehicles near the apartment around the time of the murders, their statements were noted but not seriously investigated. Security camera footage from nearby buildings that might have shown people entering or leaving the apartment building, some was reviewed, some apparently wasn't, some mysteriously disappeared before it could be analyzed. And then there was the character assassination. Unable to solve the case, seemingly unwilling to seriously investigate the possibility that this was a targeted killing of journalists and activists, the authorities did what they always do in Mexico when they can't, or won't, catch the real killers. They blamed the victims. They started leaking information, or misinformation, about the victims' personal lives. Suggesting they were involved in drugs. That their lifestyle was risky. That they brought this on themselves. Rubin's sexual orientation was leaked to media. Not relevant to the case, but used to suggest he lived a risky lifestyle. The women's sexual histories were discussed. Again, not relevant, but used to imply they were somehow responsible for what happened to them. Mile, the Colombian housekeeper, was described in some reports as possibly connected to Colombian criminal organizations. Zero evidence for this, but it fit the narrative that these weren't innocent victims of a targeted hit but rather people involved in criminal activity. It was disgusting, transparent, and effective. Because it worked. Public sympathy started to shift. Maybe these people weren't innocent after all. Maybe they were involved in something. Maybe the official story had some truth to it. Meanwhile, the actual investigation languished. No arrests. No suspects publicly identified. No progress. The families of the victims were outraged. They hired private investigators. Conducted their own interviews. Found witnesses the police had ignored. They presented this information to authorities. It was largely dismissed. The journalist and activist communities rallied. Held protests. Demanded a proper investigation. Demanded the government take seriously the possibility that this was a targeted killing. Some officials paid lip service to these demands. Promised thorough investigations. Promised results. Nothing happened. As months passed, it became clear, this case wasn't going to be solved. Not because it couldn't be. But because someone didn't want it to be. Stop here for a moment. I want to hear from you. Where are you right now? What time is it? But more importantly, what are you learning from this story? Because this isn't just about 5 people murdered in Mexico City in 2015. This is about patterns. About how power works. About how violence is used to silence dissent. So think about it. What lessons are you taking from this? Drop a comment and tell me. What does this case teach you about journalism in dangerous places? About activism? About violence against women? About government corruption? About how investigations can be manipulated? And here's the harder question. How do you avoid becoming a victim of this kind of violence? If you're a journalist, an activist, someone who speaks truth to power, how do you stay safe? Or is safety even possible? Share your thoughts. Because understanding these patterns isn't just academic. For people doing this kind of work, it's survival. Now, let's talk about what the evidence really showed. While the official investigation was busy blaming victims and pushing the robbery narrative, actual evidence was being ignored. Evidence that pointed to a very different conclusion. First, the pattern of violence. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. Robberies don't look like this. In a robbery, criminals want to get in, get valuables, get out. Quick. Minimize time at the scene. Minimize risk of being caught. The Narvar department showed evidence of prolonged violence. Hours, probably. The victims were tortured. Sexually assaulted. Beaten. This took time. Robbers don't do that. Robbers don't have time for that. Every minute at a crime scene is a minute they could be discovered. What kind of criminals spend hours torturing and sexually assaulting victims when they could be caught at any moment? The kind who aren't worried about being caught. The kind who have protection. The kind who are sending a message. Second, what was taken and what wasn't. The authorities claimed robbery but couldn't identify what was stolen. Some reports said camera equipment. But Ruben's most expensive camera was still there. His laptop. Which would contain all his photos, all his sources, all his evidence, wasn't taken. Think about that. Professional hitmen targeting a journalist, and they leave his laptop? The device that would contain everything he'd been working on? Unless they'd already accessed it. Unless they'd already gotten what they wanted from it. Unless the point wasn't to steal it but to send a message. Third, the security of the building. The Narvar department building had security. Not high-end, but basic stuff. A main entrance. A lock. You needed to be buzzed in or have a key. How did the killers get in? Did they force entry? No signs of that. Did they ring the doorbell and get buzzed up? If so, by whom? And why would any of the victims buzz in strangers on a Friday night? Or did they come with someone the victims knew? Someone they trusted? Someone who could get them to open the door? This question was never adequately investigated. Security footage was supposedly reviewed but results were never made public. Neighbors who might have seen people entering the building were interviewed but their statements weren't taken seriously. Fourth, the phone records. In any modern murder investigation, phone records are crucial. Who called whom? When? Where were phones when calls were made? The victim's phone records should have been analyzed immediately. Who called them in the hours before death? Did they call anyone? Were their phones used after they died? Did they send distress signals? Some of this was apparently done, but results weren't made public. Why? What did those records show? Who didn't investigators want people to know about? Fifth, and most importantly, the context. You can't investigate these murders in isolation. You have to consider who the victims were and what they'd been doing. Ruben had documented government corruption in Veracruz. He'd received death threats. He'd fled to Mexico City in fear for his life. Nadia had publicly accused Javier Duarte of creating a climate of violence. She'd said, on camera, that if she died, he would be responsible. Both were living in Mexico City in hiding. Both were killed in a way that suggested torture, interrogation, sending a message. This context screams targeted killing. But investigators seemed determined to ignore it. Why? What were they afraid of finding? Or who were they afraid of implicating? Sixth, the similar cases. This wasn't the first time journalists in Mexico had been killed in ways that looked like targeted hits but were officially called robberies or blamed on organized crime. There's a pattern. A well-documented pattern. Journalist investigates corruption. Journalist receives threats. Journalist is killed. Authorities blame robbery or cartels. Case goes unsolved. Ruben and Nadia's case fit that pattern perfectly. But investigators claim to see no connection to their journalism or activism. Finally, the forensic evidence of sexual assault. All 4 women were raped. All showed signs of sexual violence. In Mexico, sexual violence is often used as a weapon. A way to terrorize. A way to send a message to other women: this is what happens when you step out of line. The sexual assault in this case wasn't incidental. It was central. It was intentional. It was meant to degrade, to terrorize, to warn others. But authorities treated it as almost irrelevant. Just another detail in a robbery gone wrong. All of this evidence, the pattern of violence, the lack of theft, the security issues, the phone records, the victims' backgrounds, the similar cases, the sexual assault, all of it pointed away from robbery and toward targeted killing. But the official investigation ignored it. Minimized it. Explained it away. Because following that evidence would lead somewhere authorities didn't want to go. Would implicate people they didn't want to implicate. So instead, they pushed a narrative that made no sense. And hoped people would believe it. Many did. But many didn't. And the fight for truth was just beginning. The authorities might have wanted to sweep this case under the rug. But they'd underestimated the response from journalists, activists, and civil society. Within days of the murders, protests erupted across Mexico City. Journalists marched. Activists rallied. Demanding justice. Demanding a proper investigation. Demanding acknowledgement that this was a targeted killing, not a random robbery. The protests were huge. Thousands of people in the streets. Carrying photos of the victims. Chanting slogans about press freedom. About violence against women. About corruption. International pressure mounted too. Journalism organizations worldwide took up the case. Committee to Protect Journalists. Reporters Without Borders. Article 19. All calling on Mexico to properly investigate. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression released a statement. Said the case showed the dangerous environment for journalists in Mexico. Called for a thorough, impartial investigation. Human Rights Watch weighed in. Amnesty International. Major media outlets internationally covered the story. Mexico couldn't just make this disappear quietly. There were too many eyes watching. But the authorities tried anyway. They gave press conferences. Said they were investigating thoroughly. Said they were following all leads. Said they would find those responsible. But weeks passed. Then months. No arrests. No suspects identified. No progress. The families of the victims became increasingly vocal. They held their own press conferences. Presented evidence the police had ignored. Demanded answers. Ruben's family spoke about the threats he'd received in Veracruz. About how he'd fled to Mexico City in fear. About how he'd told them that if anything happened to him, it wouldn't be an accident. Nadia's family played that video. The one where she said that if she died, Javier Duarte would be responsible. They demanded investigators look into whether the Veracruz government had any connection to her murder. The families of Yesenia, Alejandra, and Mile demanded their loved ones be treated as important victims. Not footnotes. Not collateral damage. Full victims deserving full investigations. The pressure worked, to an extent. The authorities couldn't completely ignore it. They had to at least appear to be taking the case seriously. In August 2015, a suspect was arrested. Daniel Pacheco, a small-time criminal. Authorities claimed he'd confessed to being part of the robbery. The arrest was announced with fanfare. See, they said, we're making progress. We're solving the case. But Pacheco's arrest raised more questions than it answered. His confession was suspicious, full of details that didn't match the evidence. Clearly coerced, according to his lawyers. And he was alone. Authorities claimed he was part of a group but couldn't identify anyone else. Couldn't explain how one person could have controlled and killed 5 people. Pacheco later recanted his confession. Said he'd been tortured. That police had beaten him and threatened to kill him if he didn't confess. Medical exams confirmed he'd been tortured. But authorities dismissed this. Said he was lying. That his confession was valid. The case against Pacheco eventually fell apart. But by then, the authorities had what they wanted, a suspect. Someone to point to when people asked why the case hadn't been solved. The real investigation, into whether this was a targeted hit, into whether powerful people were involved, continued to languish. But the protests didn't stop. Every month on the 31st, the date of the murders, activists gathered outside the Attorney General's office in Mexico City. Demanding justice. Demanding truth. International Journalism Awards were created in Ruben's name. Activist awards in Nadia's name. The victims became symbols of resistance. Of the cost of speaking truth to power. Their deaths were used to illustrate the dangers journalists face in Mexico. The violence women endure. The impunity that allows killers to go free. But the families wanted more than symbolism. They wanted arrests. They wanted trials. They wanted justice. And years later, they still haven't gotten it. You can't talk about this case without talking about Veracruz. About Javier Duarte. About the climate of violence and corruption that drove Ruben and Nadia to flee. Javier Duarte was governor of Veracruz from 2010 to 2016. 6 years that saw the state descend into violence and chaos. During his administration, at least 17 journalists were killed in Veracruz. 17. More than any other state in Mexico. One of the deadliest places in the world to be a journalist. Duarte's government was credibly accused of widespread corruption. Embezzling hundreds of millions of dollars. Working with drug cartels. Using state police to harass, threaten, and kill opposition. Journalists who investigated this faced consequences. Death threats. Harassment. Their families threatened. Their sources disappeared. And some were killed. Ruben Espinosa was one of those journalists. He'd photographed protests against Duarte. Documented police violence. Covered stories about missing people and mass graves. For this, he received threats. His apartment was broken into. He was followed. Told to leave Veracruz or face consequences. When his colleague Moises Sanchez was murdered in March 2015, Ruben knew he had to go. He moved to Mexico City in June. Nadia Vera had similar experiences. As an activist organizing against Duarte's government, she was a target. She organized families of disappeared persons. She protested corruption publicly. And she called out Duarte by name. In that video that would later go viral, she said, "If something happens to me, it's Javier Duarte and his government who are responsible." That was in 2014. She was killed in 2015. After the Narvarte murders, activists demanded investigators look into possible Veracruz government involvement. They pointed out that 2 of the victims had fled Veracruz specifically because of threats. That both had publicly accused Duarte. Surely, they argued, this was worth investigating. At minimum, interview Duarte. Ask if his government had any connection to people who might have wanted these 2 dead. But that didn't happen. Or if it did, it was cursory and the results were never made public. Why? Why wouldn't you investigate the most obvious possible motive? Unless you were told not to. Unless there were political reasons not to dig too deep. Duarte, for his part, denied any involvement. Said he was saddened by the deaths. Called for justice. But his government continued to attack Ruben and Nadia after their deaths. Leaked information suggesting they were involved in criminal activity. Tried to discredit them. And when activists protested outside Veracruz government buildings, demanding Duarte answer for the climate of violence, they were met with police violence. Tear gas. Beatings. Arrests. In 2016, as federal investigations into his corruption intensified, Duarte fled Mexico. He was eventually found in Guatemala. Extradited back to Mexico. He's now in prison for corruption. But he's never been charged in connection with the Narvarte murders. Never even seriously investigated for it. The families of Ruben and Nadia believe Duarte's government was involved. Maybe not directly ordering the hits, but creating the climate. Enabling it. Possibly hiring the killers. They can't prove it. Because no one with the power to investigate has done so seriously. And that's the point. In Mexico, some investigations never happen. Some questions are never seriously asked. Some powerful people are protected, no matter what evidence suggests their involvement. Duarte is in prison. But not for the murders. For the corruption. And even that took years of pressure, years of investigation, years of him fleeing the country before he faced consequences. The journalists and activists he may have had killed? They're still dead. Their killers still free. And that's the message. You can steal millions. You can create a climate of terror. You can have people killed. And the worst that happens is you go to prison for the financial crimes. Maybe. The murders? Those can be swept under the rug. Called robberies. Blamed on cartels. Left unsolved. Because investigating them might reveal uncomfortable truths. Might implicate powerful people. Might show how deep the corruption goes. Better to let the cases go cold. Let the families suffer. Let the killers walk free. That's the calculation. And in Mexico, it's a calculation that's made again and again. 4 of the 5 people killed in the Narvarte apartment were women. All 4 were sexually assaulted before being killed. This isn't incidental. It's central to understanding the case. Mexico has a femicide crisis. Femicide, the murder of women because they are women. Not robbery gone wrong. Not domestic disputes. Murder motivated by hatred of women, by desire to control women, by viewing women as objects. The numbers are staggering. An average of 10 women are killed every day in Mexico. 10. Every day. Many of these deaths are never properly investigated. They're written off as domestic issues. Crimes of passion. The women are blamed for their own deaths. She was out too late, she dressed provocatively, she was in the wrong neighborhood. The Narvarte case fit this pattern. Once investigators couldn't sustain the robbery narrative, they shifted to blaming the victims. Especially the women. Their sexual histories were leaked. Their lifestyle choices questioned. Suggestions that they'd put themselves in danger. Never mind that they were tortured and murdered in their own apartment. Never mind that being a woman in your own home should not be a risk factor for violence. The sexual assault of all 4 women was treated as almost beside the point. Just another detail. Not evidence of a pattern. Not evidence that these women were targeted specifically because they were women. But look at how they were killed. Prolonged torture. Sexual violence. This wasn't about robbery. This was about power. About degradation. About sending a message. What message? That women who step out of line, who are activists, the victims who associate with journalists, and other women will get the message. Stay quiet, Stay vulnerable, don't make waves, can be violated. This is what femicide looks like in Mexico. And no one will seriously investigate. And it's enabled by investigations that don't take violence against the killers accountable. That treat sexual assault as incidental. That blame victims for their own murders. Nadia was an activist specifically working on women's rights. She organized against violence against women. She demanded accountability for femicides. And she was murdered in a way that specifically targeted her as a woman. Sexually assaulted. Brutalized. Her body left as a message. The irony is cruel. A woman fighting against violence against women is killed in an act of violence against women. And the investigation treats the violence as irrelevant to the case. Yesenia was 18. A teenager. She had her whole life ahead of her. She was sexually assaulted and murdered, and the investigation barely focused on her at all. She became a statistic. One of 10 women killed that day in Mexico. One of thousands killed that year. Her murder should have sparked outrage specifically about violence against young women. About how teenagers are targeted, victimized, killed. Instead, she was a footnote. The makeup artist who happened to be there. Wrong place, wrong time. Alejandra was a mother. A professional. A woman doing important social work. She was sexually assaulted and murdered, and the investigation seemed to view her as collateral damage in someone else's story. Her daughter lost her mother to femicide. But that aspect of the case, the gendered violence, was minimized. Ignored. Treated as secondary. Mile was a migrant worker. A domestic worker. A Colombian woman in Mexico. She faced triple discrimination, as a woman, as a migrant, as a domestic worker. Her murder was barely investigated. She was seen as the least important victim. The one who didn't matter as much as the others. But she mattered. Her life mattered. Her murder should have been investigated just as thoroughly as anyone else's. The fact that it wasn't tells you everything about how Mexico, how many societies, value women's lives. Especially poor women. Migrant women. Women doing undervalued labor. The Narvart case should have been investigated as femicide. As violence against women. As a hate crime based on gender. Instead, it was investigated as a robbery. Then as organized crime. Anything but what it actually was. And that's why, years later, there's no justice. Because if you don't correctly identify the crime, you can't solve it. If you ignore the gendered violence, if you ignore that these women were targeted because they were women, if you ignore the pattern of femicide in Mexico, then you'll never find the killers. Because you'll be looking in the wrong place. Asking the wrong questions. Missing the obvious truth right in front of you. As of 2024, 9 years after the murders, the Narvart case remains officially unsolved. Daniel Pacheco, the man arrested in 2015, was eventually released. The case against him fell apart. He maintains he was tortured into a false confession. No one else has been arrested. No other suspects have been publicly identified. The investigation is technically still open. But no one's working on it actively. It's cold. Forgotten by authorities, if not by the families and those who knew the victims. So what really happened? Who killed 5 people in that apartment? And why? We don't have definitive answers. But we can look at what the evidence suggests. The most likely scenario, based on all available evidence, this was a targeted hit on Ruben Espinoza and Nadia Vera. The other 3 women were killed because they were witnesses. Or to make it look like something it wasn't. The killers were probably professionals. Or at least experienced. They controlled 5 people. Spent hours torturing and interrogating them. Then killed them all and left without being identified. That takes skill. Planning. Resources. It's not a robbery crew. It's a hit squad. Who ordered the hit? That's the question authorities should have been investigating. But didn't. The evidence points to Veracruz. To people threatened by what Ruben and Nadia knew. What they documented. What they might reveal. Did Javier Duarte order it? We don't know. But people connected to his administration? People who had been enriched by his corrupt government? People who feared what investigative journalists and activists might expose? That's plausible. That's worth investigating. Or was it cartels? Organized crime threatened by journalism that exposed their operations? Also plausible. Also worth investigating. Or was it federal authorities? People at high levels who wanted to send a message to journalists and activists across Mexico? Less likely, but not impossible. And definitely worth investigating. But none of this was seriously investigated. Because doing so would have been politically uncomfortable. Would have implicated powerful people. Would have required courage from investigators. Instead, they pushed a narrative that made no sense. Arrested a scapegoat. Then let the case die quietly. The families haven't given up. They continue to push for investigation. To demand answers. To seek justice. But realistically, 9 years later, what are the chances? Evidence has degraded. Witnesses have disappeared or died. Suspects have had years to hide. The political will to solve the case, if it ever existed, is long gone. And that's the tragedy. Not just that 5 people were murdered. But that their killers will almost certainly never face justice. That their families will never get closure. That the truth will probably never be fully known. This is what impunity looks like. This is what happens when powerful people can kill with confidence that they won't be caught. Won't be punished. Won't even be seriously investigated. And the message this sends to other journalists, other activists, other women in Mexico? It's clear. Speak out and you might die. And if you do, no one will solve your murder. Your death will be explained away. Your character will be attacked. Your killers will go free. That's the reality. That's what the Narvarte case teaches us. And until that changes, until Mexico develops a justice system that actually investigates these cases, that actually holds powerful people accountable, that actually values women's lives, the killing will continue. More journalists will die. More activists will be silenced. More women will be murdered. And most of the cases will go unsolved. Just like Narvarte. The Narvarte murders happened in 2015. But they're part of a pattern that continues today. Mexico is one of the most dangerous countries in the world for journalists. Not a war zone. Not a failed state. A democracy with freedom of press guaranteed in the Constitution. And yet, journalists are killed regularly. Over 100 journalists have been killed in Mexico since 2000. Over 100. In 24 years. Most of these murders go unsolved. The killers are never caught. The people who ordered the hits are never identified. The pattern is always the same. Journalist investigates corruption or cartel activity. Journalist receives threats. Journalist is killed. Authorities call it robbery or cartel violence. Case goes cold. Ruben Espinosa fit this pattern perfectly. So did Moises Sanchez before him. So did Regina Martinez in 2012. So have dozens of others. And when journalists see this pattern, when they see colleagues murdered with impunity, they get the message. Self-censor or risk death. Many choose self-censorship. They avoid certain topics. Don't investigate certain people. Don't publish certain stories. Can you blame them? When the choice is between exposing corruption and staying alive, when you know the government won't protect you and won't investigate your murder, what do? Some journalists, like Rubin, refuse to self-censor. They keep doing the work. They keep exposing wrongdoing. They accept the risk. And some of them die for it. But here's what you need to understand. When journalists are killed with impunity, when their murders go unsolved, everyone loses. Not just the journalists. Not just their families. Society as a whole. Because without investigative journalism, corruption thrives unchecked. Cartels operate freely. Government officials steal with impunity. Human rights abuses go unreported. Democracy cannot function without a free press. And a press is not free if journalists can be killed for doing their jobs. Mexico has freedom of press on paper. In the Constitution. In the laws. But not in reality. In reality, reporting the wrong story about the wrong person can get you killed. And your killer will probably never be caught. That's not press freedom. That's the appearance of freedom with the reality of censorship through violence. And it's not just Mexico. Journalists are targeted worldwide. In Russia. In Saudi Arabia. In the Philippines. In many other countries. The methods vary. Sometimes it's direct murder. Sometimes it's imprisonment on trumped-up charges. Sometimes it's legal harassment. Sometimes it's cyber attacks and online threats. But the goal is always the same: silence journalists. Stop them from reporting inconvenient truths. Make others afraid to follow in their footsteps. Rubin Espinosa's murder was part of this global war on press freedom. His death was meant to terrify other journalists. To make them think twice before investigating corruption in Veracruz or anywhere else. Did it work? For some journalists, yes. But others have continued the work. Have kept investigating. Have kept exposing corruption. Because they understand that giving in to fear means giving up on truth. Means letting corruption and violence win. But they shouldn't have to make that choice. Journalists shouldn't have to choose between doing their jobs and staying alive. There should be protection. Real protection. Not just laws on paper but actual security. Actual investigation when journalists are threatened. Actual prosecution when they're killed. Mexico has a protection mechanism for journalists. It exists. But it's underfunded, poorly managed, and often ineffective. Journalists request protection. They're told to fill out forms. Wait for approval. Meanwhile, they're still at risk. And when they're killed, the protection mechanism is revealed to have failed. But no one is held accountable for the failure. What would real protection look like? Investigation of threats taken seriously. Police protection for at-risk journalists. Witness protection for sources. Fast-tracked asylum for journalists who need to leave. And most importantly, actual prosecution of people who kill journalists. Not scapegoats. Not patsies. The actual masterminds. The people who order the hits. Until that happens, Mexico will continue to be one of the deadliest countries for journalists. And democracy will continue to suffer. Because Rubin Espinosa died for doing his job. Nadia Vera died for demanding accountability. And their deaths remain unsolved because investigating them would threaten powerful people. That's not just a failure of justice. It's a failure of democracy. We've reached the end of this story. But before we close, I need to hear from you one more time. Where are you right now? What time is it there? And most importantly, what have you learned from this case? What lessons are you taking away? Tell me in the comments, what does the Narvart case teach you about journalism? About activism? About violence against women? About corruption and impunity? And here's the hardest question: if you're a journalist or activist working in a dangerous environment, how do you avoid becoming the next Ruben or Nadia? How do you stay safe while still doing the work that needs to be done? Or is safety even possible? Is the only real choice between silence and risk? Some people will say Ruben and Nadia could have stayed alive if they'd just stayed quiet. If they'd stopped investigating. Stopped protesting. Stopped demanding accountability. But is that really living? Is survival without purpose, without truth, without fighting for what's right, is that acceptable? I don't think they would have thought so. They made their choices knowing the risks. They did the work because it mattered. Because someone had to do it. But they shouldn't have had to die for it. So what can be done? How do we create a world where journalists and activists can do their work without fear of death? First, pressure on governments. International pressure. Domestic pressure. Constant pressure to investigate attacks on journalists. To prosecute those responsible. To protect press freedom. Second, support for journalists and activists. Financial support for security measures. Legal support when they're threatened. Asylum when they need to flee. Third, attention. Keep these cases in the public eye. Don't let them be forgotten. Don't let authorities sweep them under the rug. Fourth, accountability. When journalists are killed, when cases go unsolved, hold officials accountable. Vote them out. Protest. Demand better. Fifth, solidarity. If you're a journalist or activist, don't work alone. Build networks. Support each other. Share information. Look out for each other. Sixth, documentation. Document threats. Keep records. Make sure others know what you're working on and what risks you're facing. So if something happens, people know it wasn't random. Seventh, smart security. Use encryption. Protect sources. Vary your routines. Don't be predictable. Take basic security seriously. But honestly, sometimes none of that is enough. Sometimes people do everything right and still die. Because the forces arrayed against them are too powerful. Because violence can reach anyone anywhere. That's the hard truth. There's no foolproof way to stay safe while doing dangerous work in dangerous places. So you make a choice. You decide what matters more, safety or truth. Silence or speaking out. Comfort or justice. Ruben and Nadia made their choice. So did the thousands of other journalists and activists who've been killed for their work. They chose to speak. To document. To demand better. Even knowing the cost. Their deaths are tragedies. Injustices. Crimes that remain unpunished. But their work lives on. The photos Ruben took. The activism Nadia did. The truths they exposed. That doesn't die. And every journalist who continues investigating. Every activist who continues organizing. Every person who refuses to be silenced. They're honoring that legacy. The Narvart murders were meant to instill fear. To silence. To warn others, this is what happens when you speak out. But they had the opposite effect. They galvanized. They inspired. They showed people what they're fighting against. 9 years later, the case remains unsolved. The killers walk free. Justice has been denied. But the fight continues. For truth. For justice. For a Mexico where journalists can work without fear. Where activists can organize without dying. Where women can exist without being targeted for violence. That fight is being waged by the families of the victims. By other journalists and activists. By anyone who believes truth matters. That justice matters. That lives matter. And that fight won't end until Mexico changes. Until the culture of impunity ends. Until powerful people can no longer kill with confidence they'll never face consequences. How long will that take? Years. Decades. Maybe longer. But it's worth fighting for. Ruben and Nadia thought so. The thousands of others killed for similar reasons thought so. And those of us left behind have a responsibility. To keep their memories alive. To keep demanding justice. To keep doing the work they died for. Because the alternative, silence, complicity, acceptance of violence, that's not acceptable. This is the story of the Narvar apartment murders. 5 people killed. 0 arrests. 0 justice. But it's also a story about courage. About people who refused to be silenced. Who did important work knowing the risks. And it's a call to action. For all of us. To support press freedom. To demand accountability. To refuse to accept that this is just how things are. Because it doesn't have to be this way. Mexico can be better. The world can be better. But only if enough people decide it matters. Decide to fight for it. Decide that truth and justice are worth the cost. Ruben Espinoza. Nadia Vera. Yesenia Quiroz. Alejandra Negrete. Mile Virginia Martin. Remember their names. Remember their stories. Remember what they died for. And don't let their deaths be in vain.